Welcome to Disruptive Successor, a show for next generation leaders in family businesses and entrepreneurs who want to disrupt the status quo and take their existing business to a whole new level. We all know that what got us here isn't going to get us there. This show will provide inspiration, advice, and resources to help you create massive impact. This podcast is sponsored by myself, Jonathan Goldhill, and my company, the Goldhill Group, where we provide coaching for growing companies. I'm Jonathan Goldhill, and my purpose is simple: to guide entrepreneurial leaders in family businesses towards more freedom and fulfillment. I want entrepreneurs to get clarity around the changes that will make them and their businesses more successful so they can experience the same freedom I've enjoyed in my life. Our proven practices challenge business owners to think differently about their business and how they're running it, and quite literally become game changers in our clients' companies. Learn more at thegoldhillgroup.com website, where you can schedule your free strategy session. Hi, it's Jonathan Goldhill, and welcome back to another episode of the Disruptive Successor Show. My guest today is Liz Kislik, a management consultant and executive coach, and a frequent contributor to Harvard Business Review and Forbes. Her TEDx talk, "Why is there so much conflict at work and what can you do to fix it?" has received more than 400,000 views. Liz specializes in developing high-performing leaders and workforces, and for 30 years has helped family-run businesses as well as national nonprofits and Fortune 500 companies like American Express, Girl Scouts, Staples, and Highlights for Children solve their thorniest problems. In today's episode, we'll be talking about leadership and organizational topics from conflict and conflict resolution to culture, leadership development, talent management, and more. Anything that affects how people can do better and feel better at work. Liz, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm so interested to hear what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, well, I think, conflict is a really interesting topic, I think. And, Liz, I was telling you just before our call that I'm involved in some communities of coaching. I was a scaling up certified coach. I was involved in EOS for a short period of time as an implementer, and then pretty much doing it on my own. And I specialize in family businesses. And what is sometimes really apparent to me is that it's not always clear that there's conflict at place. That there's conflict that's happening. And so I find it interesting. I make mention of those two sort of business operating systems because there's no single chapter in those books that talks about conflict at work and like conflict models and resolution models. And yet it's more rampant than we see. So that's what I want to talk with you about today. And I guess let's start with, why is there so much conflict at work?
Because it's hard to get things done. I mean, one of the things that's so funny, we actually are often in conflict with our own selves.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. We have more than one point of view on a subject, or we want things that are mutually exclusive, or at least you can't have at the same time. So if we're in conflict with ourselves from time to time, doesn't it just make sense that you add more people to that mix?
Sure.
And there are going to be more opinions, more egos, more potential for loss or gain. These are the kinds of things that get people riled up.
And so is there some things that you see that are obvious to you that when someone's in conflict with themselves, does it manifest in some particular way? Or, the way they speak, the way they look?
Everybody's different.
Mm-hmm,
and you have to get used to the person you're dealing with. So some people just will do anything they can to avoid facing whatever the conflict is, even if it is only their own. I was with a client last week, and one of the things we talked about was when your values are in conflict. with yourself. There are two things you want to serve. I mean, in any business, it's pretty common that sometimes doing what is absolutely the best thing for customers is actually not good for employees, or vice versa.
Wow.
Right? I mean, there are naturally things where a customer or a client might want something, and that requires an employee to work extra hours, to redo work, to go out of their way, all kinds of things. And yet we live with this every day. And we kind of think of it as normal, which may be why your interesting point is so apt about these frameworks not even referencing conflict as a tangible part of business. But if you can't deal with it, it's really hard to run your business.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the only place, honestly, that I see it in these frameworks, by the way, is because both of these, the EOS and Scaling Up, they almost always recommend the Pat Lencioni books, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And I think one of its primary focuses is conflict and resolving conflict. And I think that's what the table group is probably most gifted at, is identifying and solving conflict. A lot of times it starts with just trust. And that's his foundational thinking, is that if there isn't trust, then how can you engage in conflict and have it be healthy conflict? Because you don't trust the other person's not going to hurt you or be mean to you or something like that.
So I have two thoughts about that. One is we have to do it anyway. Mm-hmm. We're often in circumstances, maybe it comes up less inside our own shop and more dealing with a vendor in some ways where we're not confident that they have our best interests at heart. Mm-hmm. And you still have to figure out how to work things through with them, whether you call it conflict or not. You might call it negotiation, but that could be a conflict. The other thing is, and where I differ from Lencioni just a little bit, I don't think leaders can provide trust. I think they can provide safety. But trust is something we bring ourselves based on our own experiences.
Right.
I'm sure you've seen, Jonathan, there are people who never will trust. It doesn't matter who they work for. It doesn't matter how you go out of your way.
I see it in some of my clients today. Right.
Some people can't do it.
So the leader has to provide safety. That is a really powerful point. And then trust can flow from that person when they feel safe.
That's right.
Does everyone's safety look the same though? Right. Okay.
No,
so it doesn't. Of course not.
Right. The reason there's conflict is because we have interpersonal dynamics. And part of why the frameworks, I'm making this up, this is a big speculation on my part, but part of why the frameworks don't address it, they're not really addressing the interpersonal aspects as people live them. There are procedures, there are guidelines, there are structures. Those are the things that, if they're really excellent, can help prevent conflict. Although more often than not, they are root causes of many conflicts, pre-existing structures that now humans have to cope with that may or may not work for today's challenges, or may again set people at odds. Another really common one that everybody will understand is we often treat, recognize, and compensate salespeople differently from the way, for example, we might treat, recognize, and compensate operations people or production people. We want different things from them. And of course, therefore, we try to motivate them according to their pursuits. But that means we are inherently creating a conflict or a tension that is very hard for them to resolve interpersonally. Because if the salesperson is being paid to get every possible customer, part of what you want to do with your customers is customize, tailor things, make sure it's good for that customer.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the ops person is being compensated to make everything as standardized and efficient as possible.
Yes.
Those are at odds.
Right. An inherent conflict there, plus the delivery schedule versus the schedule of being able to sell it, definitely at odds there as well. So, yeah, these are interesting challenges. And so it positions those people in those different departments to be having some tension with each other that's difficult to resolve.
And maybe to be suspicious of each other too.
Correct.
Going back to your point about trust.
Because I was thinking of, when you talked about structures, I was thinking of your behavioral pattern or profile, like let's just say DISC or Myers-Briggs or whatever, you're familiar with. And that, a person who's a high DI, dominant, influencing, direct, is it conflict with someone who's an SC in the DISC language, someone who's steady and conscientious? Their pace, everything about those two types of people is very different. And so they're at odds as well. And so the behavioral profile or pattern or structure that they have, the lens that they look through is different, and it makes it difficult.
Yes. Another way of looking at how humans become structure. The nature of the most senior leader also becomes a structural object.
Yes.
Right? How that decision maker operates is a structural norm for everybody else. How you make a case has to be in a way that that person can recognize and accept. How you get a decision or don't, that becomes a structural part of your job, assuming that they are consistent and not just mercurial completely.
Right. All right. Let's change gears here a little bit, and let's talk about family businesses, because that's a different structure than non-family businesses. And especially the more generations of family, the more complex. And I'm sure you've worked with a multi-generational business. I believe Highlights for Children, if I'm not mistaken, is like a fourth generation, or maybe fifth generation business. Lots of generations of family members in there.
Yeah.
So how is conflict different in family businesses from your perspective?
So first of all, it has all the same characteristics plus.
Mm-hmm.
I would say there are no characteristics that are present other places that aren't also present in family businesses, although, of course, to differing degrees, depending on the culture.
Mm-hmm.
So in family businesses that are not being run by the fourth generation, because that's not the majority. So let's talk first about the regular 1 and 2 generational actual leaders in the shop. These are the people you see either at home every night or for Thanksgiving, etc. And you have dual roles. You are both a loved one and a business colleague. And there are things you would never say to a business colleague that you would say to a loved one, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
On top of which, the interpersonal patterns that are set in the family, those are often carried into the dynamics of the business. So one of the things that happens, just as a for instance, many parents have a hard time recognizing their adult children as the full adults that they are.
Right.
Sometimes they, introduce their 40-year-old kid by the nickname he had when he was
I get it. I know. I was Johnny. My mother always called me Johnny, and she never graduated back to what she named me in the first place, which was Jonathan. So and it always felt belittling to me.
Demeaning.
Demeaning. Yeah.
Probably not her intention.
No.
But you are aware of other people noticing that you were an 11-year-old.
Yes.
That can undercut your authority.
Naked. Exactly. And
really tough.
Yeah. Very tough.
Really tough. Similarly, weird sibling dynamics can be played out in the business. I mean, sometimes siblings are the best possible support for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the advantages of having siblings is they're really the only people who know just how nuts your parents are.
Right.
No, nobody else really gets certain weird things. But the jockeying for position, conflict in styles, and also regression that can happen under pressure, where we go back to behaving the way we were as children, even if we know better now.
Right. Kind of crazy.
Kind of crazy. The other thing that's difficult in family businesses is when members of the family tell the other members of the team, we want everyone to be like family. And that's really hard. That's really hard because
they're not, and they don't own it. And that's, I mean, the same conflict or similar conflict exists between owners and non-owners.
Yes.
And I'm talking about just employees versus leaders.
Yes.
Leaders want employees to have an ownership mindset, but it's difficult to have that ownership mindset. And if everyone had an ownership mindset, I mean, I encourage that ownership mindset, but if everyone had it, they might all be owners and entrepreneurs.
You couldn't get anything done.
Exactly.
The other thing is, it really depends on who the owner is, but too often when they say to employees, I want you to have a leadership mindset, what they mean is, I want you to make the decisions I would make if I were doing your job, even though I don't know your job.
Right.
And that is a bind. That's actually a really loaded situation. Very often, it is not an encouragement to be your best, smartest, most innovative self. It's to model yourself on the leader as much as possible. Mm. But as is often the case with entrepreneurs, startups, and even, family-led businesses, exactly to your point before, if everybody operated like that leader, you'd go out of business. They need other kinds of people with other kinds of knowledge and also other personalities to supplement and complement them. Because there are too many different kinds of situations that crop up in the course of running the place.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I don't ever get into conversations about this diversity, equity, inclusion. It's not part of my lexicon. It's not part of my clients' lexicon, mostly because they're smaller businesses. There's no mandate to do any of this stuff at those smaller businesses. But as I'm listening to you, I am agreeing that having different personality styles, having different, like having diversity and being inclusive of men and women and, hard charging and, heavy analytical thinking, all those different types is so valuable. And that we need that's what makes for a great team. That's what makes for great competitive advantage in the marketplace, is being able to include all these different personality types or types of people and make them work well together. That's really powerful, much more powerful than the same types.
That's what all the statistics show in the first place.
Okay.
Very helpful to have the kinds of diversity you mentioned, as well as racial diversity, unless you are only serving people in your little white neighborhood. I mean, right. You really need all kinds, because none of us can anticipate how all our customers would behave, how all our vendors would behave. In the hurly-burly of life, we come up against different kinds of people and different needs. You have to be open to be able to tolerate people who are different from you.
Yeah.
Some people don't grow up with that tolerance as an early skill. So the idea of it's better for your business is actually really important.
You make interesting points, and you're obviously very thoughtful about it, even the way you speak about all this. And I can see you've worked at many different levels in terms of, Fortune 500, probably smaller family-run companies and maybe larger family-run companies like we just talked about, highlights for children. Let's talk about the damage that conflict does and talk about the damage that conflict avoidance does. And then I want to get into your TEDx talk and learn more about it. So three questions I've kind of queued up. Let's talk about the damage that conflict does in the workplace.
Okay, I may actually go back and forth between the damage of conflict and the damage of conflict avoidance.
Great.
Because it is like a balancing act in some ways. And people see usually the damage of what they think of as conflict, which is often people yelling, maybe cursing at each other. If you have been in a place or run a place where people throw things and slam the door, if you work there, get out if you can.
Right.
And if you own it, I'm telling you now, please stop immediately. There are loads of kinds of help to stop. Talk about not building safety. Yeah, one of the best ways in the world. So the damage of that kind of thing is people are afraid to bring up true, important facts because they're afraid you'll be mad. They're afraid someone will curse at them, yell at them, or that they will have to fight back. And so often when you're making a significant business decision, you're not playing with a full deck because there are truths that people will not bring you. That's just one very obvious thing. The second is related to conflict avoidance. When people can't resolve things through direct conversation, they have to go around, or they have to hide.
Right.
Either one. And both of those are avoidant forms of conflict management. And avoidance and hiding both come from fear. Every bad thing comes from fear. I mean, that's just the way it works. All
good things come from love. Every bad thing comes from fear.
Every bad thing comes from fear. And when you have avoidance, again, people don't tell the truth. If you know that your boss can't take it or goes silent, you don't want to be the person they are silent on. Then you feel frozen out.
Correct.
So you avoid. Part of what happens is not just that, worse decisions get made. The waste in time and energy is extraordinary. I'm sure you've been places, probably all of the audience has been places, where there has to be a meeting before the meeting and a meeting in the parking lot after the meeting.
Oh, yeah.
So that you can talk about what didn't get said.
Right.
What actually happened.
So unhealthy.
What it meant.
Yeah.
So unhealthy. So time consuming.
Yeah.
When you could be running market tests, it's just a waste. Being able to put things on the table in a thoughtful, neutral way with data.
Right. Well, that's where
gift.
Engaging in constructive conflict it makes so much sense. And we have to teach that, I think, as coaches to our clients. What does that look like? How do you create safety, is to your point, and how do you engage in conflict that's constructive? So I'm pretty sure you know the name John Gottman, who wrote, I think, in Harvard Business Review about the Four Horsemen, and he talked about these other styles that I think are conflict avoidance. One is contempt, contemptuousness, like where you're, I guess, contemptuous would be described as maybe being almost sardonically mean towards someone and maybe then walking away. It's like
disdainful, scornful.
It's pretty
rejection.
Bad, really bad, right?
Very
Being
bad.
Defensive is another one of those characteristics where you really don't engage in the conflict. You defend yourself and you protect yourself because of fear, and then you maybe walk away. Stonewalling, which is just sort of what you talked about, where just like avoidance, just by, I don't want to talk about that, even if it's just explicit. I don't want to talk about that, and walking away. I'm drawing a blank on the fourth one, but these are criticism, and criticism is another way of, it's like contempt. It puts you down and makes you feel invalidated. So lack of safety. right? Really difficult to move through these issues. And now what if they're embedded in a family whose dynamics are like that? How do we help these people? Any thoughts? You seem to think well on your feet.
Thank you.
Or sitting down, as the case may be.
No, I'm on my feet. One of the things that I really like from John Gottman is the discussion of what's called a bid for connection.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sticking with Gottman first as a curative. And that is that there is always a way to engage the other person that's not about the conflict itself, because it is excruciatingly hard to work on the conflict if you can't work on it with the other person.
Mm-hmm.
There are things you can do yourself.
Right.
You can manage yourself in a variety of ways. So I'm fond of talking about two aspects of emotional intelligence. One is self-awareness. I know when this happens, I turn red, I feel hot, my stomach clenches. You know, what we all have physical reactions because we perceive, our bodies perceive, and our brains perceive that we're under threat. And you were talking about defensiveness. Well, defensiveness can be flight.
Yes.
But it can also be fight and the attempt to overpower the other person.
Right.
Right? You're wrong. You're just wrong. We can't even have this discussion because you're so wrong.
Right.
And then no one can speak. So self-awareness of when you are feeling under threat and self-regulation so that you can calm yourself to actually deal with what's in front of you, which is what we should teach children.
Yes.
And frankly, what any adult should have a practice in.
I agree. And yet they don't even understand these concepts probably. And maybe it's because emotional intelligence is a more modern field. And so older adults have never been raised like that. And then the leaders of yesterday's generation were command and control, like military style. And it was autocratic approaches to this is what we're going to do here.
Yeah. That meant that the leader could dictate.
Yes.
And if you didn't like it, you were either shoved out or you left.
Right.
There wasn't a lot of leeway. Now that we expect collaboration, that's a whole other ballgame, because you have to be able to get along to collaborate, and you have to be able to disagree. Otherwise, the collaboration may look nice, may sound nice, but it may not accomplish anything, because if everybody had the same opinion, you can't make much change when you need it.
Yeah. So a question you might not have the answer to, and I have no clue on, is do millennials and Gen Z, which I believe is the ones that are younger than millennials, do you think that their emotional intelligence, which would be self-awareness, self-regulation, is higher than older adults because they've learned from the generations before? Do you know if there's any data on that at all?
It's a great question. I don't know the data. I'm not expert in it.
Yeah.
I'm sure there is data.
Yeah.
Totally confident. What I can tell you from observation, Gen Z is coming up with somewhat more self-awareness, but not necessarily the tools to then express either what they need or what they see in a way that's helpful to other people. One of the problems is it's just harder when you're younger, you know less.
Right, of course.
So you may be aware of your own feelings in the matter and have very strong views about it. Your self-awareness could actually be good. But if you can't convey what you need, or if you can't make a case for why somebody should do something different from what they're doing before you show up with your opinions, they just treat you like a young fool.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of generational disdain still does exist. And some of that is just youth. And making room for that would be so helpful.
Well, I think that's one of the biggest problems in generational transitions from, one generation to the next, passing the torch of the business. And that's a little bit of what my podcast will be last week to the listeners today was about, where I talked about 7 keys to successful transition of leadership. They both have to be humble, the predecessor and the successor, and they have to be on the same page, and they have to be a unified front and announce, like, this is the change. It's January 1st, starting then, John Jr. will be in charge or whatever. These are difficult things to do if there isn't that trust, if they have conflict. It doesn't oftentimes go so smoothly like that.
Right. I mean, think about the nature of someone who has built a business. A lot of humility can get in the way of bulling through the things you need to get done.
Yeah, right.
Right. So the lived practice may not be a humble one. Right. It may be an assertive one.
Right.
And then the idea that someone is going to take over from me and I will no longer be the one in charge, that's rough stuff. Will I even know who I am anymore if I don't have troops to control, if my word is not what goes? That's very challenging. Just as a human being, you have to shift your whole idea of who you are as a person.
Right.
And what I've noticed, Jonathan, I'd be so interested in your opinion about this. In general, if people plan succession and transition when they are still in their 50s or early 60s, when they see a lot of life after the transition, my experience, it goes better. If they wait till they're in their 70s, they don't know what else they have, and they really, really, really have a hard time.
I agree. I don't think they don't let go, and they think they're going to keep holding on. And I think there's a lot of maybe delusion around, or maybe delusion, I don't know, or inaccuracy or inaccurate perception around how set up these people or the business is to succeed without them. It's a difficult thing. So what we're talking about, folks, right, is the hard driving entrepreneurial leader who built this business by him or herself is suddenly faced with having to let go and recognize that someone else could maybe do it as well. And I mean, I always say, quoting from Dan Sullivan, strategic coach, that if someone can do something 80% as well as you should think about letting it go and letting them do it, so you can move on to something more, maybe something that you're more passionate about. But it's really hard, very difficult.
It's really hard, particularly if you haven't built those other passions.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So
hugely so. One of the big problems of exiting businesses is that people don't know what to do. And according to John Warlow, who wrote books about exiting, and is that 75% of owners regret the sale of their business during the first year. They've lost themselves. They don't know what they're supposed to do with their lives.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So from the largest human perspective, we're all better off if we keep reinventing ourselves all the time.
Yes.
Because the other thing about holding on, you're suppressing the next generation. You may also be suppressing the business, because the very act of holding on means you're less open to new ways. And yet the world is changing constantly. So you may not see yourself losing market share. You may be terrific enough. The business may be fantastic. But there could be upside you're leaving on the table because you didn't shift, because it all had to be your way.
Yep. I agree. I was going to name my book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, but Marshall Goldsmith already had that title, and my publisher said, they'll never find your book. And when I did name it Disruptive Successor, my partner in life, she said to me, why would anyone she's an entrepreneur, why would anyone want a disruptive successor? And I said, blah, 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 well, I'm going to do a podcast on as a guest with Tharawat magazine next week or the week after, where I'm going to have to answer that question. And I think it's because for the same things that you've been, and we've been talking about today, which is that if you want to take that business to the next level, then you're going to have to see things differently, do things differently. The goal and objective might still be the same, much larger, but yeah, there's going to have to be a big change, and it's going to be disruptive. Just the change, some people. What I've always seen, by the way, Liz, in some of the smaller companies is some of the employees that were like the first hired by typically in my case, it was a father who was running a company, that person oftentimes can't adopt to the new ways of doing things. They're using now technology to track your time and your work, and you're measuring things differently that weren't being measured before. It's very difficult. And those people don't always make the change. When you make for a very intentional culture and you start declaring what your core values are, and you start, hiring and firing and interviewing and doing your performance reviews according to these core values, that's a very different regimen and regime than what the predecessor was doing. So
should we be recommending, Jonathan, that by the time you've been in the business for 5 years, you need to be looking out 10 years?
Yeah, that's great.
Right? And thinking about what might the shifts be. I may not even recognize them. Things are going great now, but I know they're coming. So how do I make sure that I'm not just building a culture of sticks in the mud?
Yeah. Well, I mean, these are challenging issues that people who are head down focus on making a product, selling a product, or just making sure they're profitable. They don't get to look at these more equally as important issues, but they're less tangible, less visible, and yet they show the results in the bottom line, in the profitability, in the employee engagement, in how likely people are to recommend that a friend to come work at that same company. I mean, these are more intangible things they don't see. And it's our job, I think, to help them see that. It does translate to the bottom line.
Yep. Yeah.
So
my father used to say something like, the business of the family business is to employ the family, basically to take care of the family.
Right.
And it is very hard to sustain that if you don't have ongoing growth.
Yep, 100%.
And it doesn't just have to be growth in volume. It could be growth in quality, but something's got to be more just to stay where you are.
Yeah. All right. So I said earlier, we're going to cover your TEDx talk. What haven't we talked about? Or give us the gist about your TEDx talk and why we should watch it. Or who should watch it? Maybe that would be a helpful question.
Actually, anybody in an organization should watch it, really. Mm-hmm. And instead of giving the gist, I'm going to stick in a couple of things from that talk that we haven't touched on here.
Great.
So in the beginning, we were talking about structures and how that can lock people in place and make it very difficult to create change.
Yep.
But another thing that can make it really difficult is when there's a bad apple in the bunch. And in startups, privately held, family, all of that, you often have two different kinds of potential bad apples, and identifying them and dealing with them as quickly as you can is really a lifesaver. One kind is the person who just behaves badly, so badly that it does damage all the time. Because nobody wants to work with them, they avoid them, all the things we talked about before that are terrible costs. The other, though, is when you have somebody who's incompetent. That often happens in family businesses because you're looking for a place to put the family member and they may not really fit. They may not have the skills and experiences that are necessary. But sometimes it also happens because you bring somebody in from the outside and you don't fully explain to them how your business really works. And so they try to operate the way they did wherever they were before. And you hired them for that skill set, but you didn't realize that they would apply it to your business like a sledgehammer.
Mm.
Knowing when either of those things is happening, the bad person or the sledgehammer, identifying that quickly and working with the person either to come to a good place or to move them out is vital.
Yeah, I agree. One of the tools that I have found to be the most appreciated by my clients is when there's conflict is to give them a conversation worksheet, like the crucial conversations model or critical conversations framework model, and let them see that there's a way of communicating that's very specific, that's very based in like my experiences, or what I call an I message, spoken first by, I feel, or I think, or I see. Give them a specific example, tell them the impact that creates and how that makes you feel, or, what it makes you do, and then ask for their response. I find that to be really helpful in a lot of situations.
I'm glad that's been helpful. May I give you a caution about it?
Please.
Sometimes people don't actually care how the other person feels.
Right.
And that can be true in family businesses too.
Mm-hmm.
Or sometimes how the person feels. It may really be their feeling, and that's valid. Feelings are data.
Right.
But that doesn't mean they should win the argument.
I understand. I agree.
And
I do. Yeah. I do think sharing the experience of how you experience it, you can invalidate how someone experiences it. They may not be experiencing it in a healthy way, but it's a good communication bridge to get on this, at least for people to understand where the other person's coming from.
Exactly. And I think it's important to know who you're giving that tool to.
Yep.
And to make sure that all the people who are working from that perspective, like they're on the same ice floe together.
Yep.
And actually get it. I have seen circumstances in which the person who is the most willing to share not what we think of as the good kind of vulnerability, but their pain and suffering over things that might be the smallest, littlest thing, can actually hold up or sort of pocket veto entire initiatives because nobody wants to go to the mat with them. It's too painful. Business is not the place to work through deep-seated problems.
Right. I agree.
Right? Everybody needs to be on the same kind of business appropriate level.
Exactly.
And I think particularly in families, therapy or counseling can be unbelievably helpful because there are deep-seated emotional things. But if you're having a deep-seated emotional problem with your sibling who is your counterpart in the business, and you still have to deal with managers who are employees, you don't need to dredge up all that stuff and share it. It is not helpful to the employees. It scares them, and it gives them too much to talk about.
Yep. Understood and agreed. So, all right. Well, we need to wrap up here, Liz. It's been thoroughly enjoyable chatting with you today. I hope people found some value. Any final closing thoughts, as well as any thoughts on if someone wants to get a hold of you and they want to learn more about your practice? Please.
Thank you for that.
Turn to share.
So the best way they can get to me, besides LinkedIn, of course, is on my website, where there's also a free ebook about the interpersonal aspects of conflict at work that could be helpful to people. And that will give them access to my blogs or newsletter. I've got more than 10 years of content there, a lot of which is about how we deal with each other at work.
Fantastic.
Very practical.
And so that's lizkislik.com, Liz, KIS, one S, and kiss, lick, LIK.com.
Exactly so.
Perfect. Awesome. Liz, it was a pleasure having you as a guest on the show. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and wisdom. Folks, go check out her TEDx talk, Why There's So Much Conflict at Work and What You Can Do to Fix It. Check out her website. And you know the drill. If you enjoyed this show, please share it with others, like, subscribe, and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast listening application of choice. Thanks, and stay tuned for future episodes of the Disruptive Successor Show. This podcast is sponsored by myself, Jonathan Goldhill, and my company, the Goldhill Group, where we provide coaching for growing companies. I'm Jonathan Goldhill, and my purpose is simple: to guide entrepreneurial leaders in family businesses towards more freedom and fulfillment. I want entrepreneurs to get clarity around the changes that will make them and their businesses more successful so they can experience the same freedom I've enjoyed in my life. Our proven practices challenge business owners to think differently about their business and how they're running it, and quite literally become game changers in our clients' companies. Learn more at thegoldhillgroup.com website, where you can schedule your free strategy session. Thank you for joining us on the Disruptive Successor Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, review, and share with a friend who would benefit from the message. If you're interested in picking up a copy of my book, Disruptive Successor, go to disruptivesuccessor.com.